And just some housekeeping notes. If you have questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A function to write those down. John or I will try and respond during the presentation, and then if we don't get to it, we'll get to it at the end when we have questions and answer session. So try and use the Q&A and not the chat if you can remember, but we'll check both to make sure that we're not overlooking anything. And we are going to wait kind of until the end of the presentation to get into it so we can go back to any questions or slides as you enter your questions through that feature. And we'll be sure to get to all of those presentations. And yeah, just as a reminder, we are having multiple presentations. We've got 4 of these. They're all going to be the same. So if you've signed up for another presentation and you want to attend, you're more than welcome, but it's going to be the same information. But we're doing all these different days and times to make sure that we give people the opportunity to join and answer questions, ask questions directly, in addition to using Speak Up and any of our other channels that we have. And we'll talk about all the different ways you can provide feedback through this presentation. So it's 6:33, John, we want to go ahead and get started.
Yeah, let's get started. All right, well, welcome everyone. I'm John Ferruzzi. I'm the manager of the Mobility Division at the City of Arvada. We are going to be talking about shared micromobility here tonight. And just to give you an update on what this presentation format looks like and what to expect, we are going to go through some background information to start with, and then talk about some first and last mile connectivity issues related to transit, go through micromobility, what it is and how it works, and then speak about it as to our project area as a pilot area, and then we'll get into questions and discussion. As I mentioned, I'm John Ferruzzi. I'm the manager of the Mobility and Planning Innovations Division at the City of Arvada, the Public Works Department. I'm joined here with my colleague, Adam Lind. He's our bike ped coordinator at the city. And our other colleague on this project is Derek Fern. He's the parking and travel demand management coordinator at the city. So to provide you with a little bit of information, I wanted to be sure to start with a little background and provide you with some information about the Transportation Committee and their involvement with this project. In 2019, after the opening of the G-Line stations, there was some discussion about first and last mile connectivity to the G-Line station from the neighborhood areas. And as part of that process, the committee evaluated a number of different options and recommended that we have a 3-part solution as a connectivity to the G-Line transit service. The recommendation, the 3 parts, is to focus on a 1-mile radius of the stations, to encourage private sector micromobility programs, as to not have a city-run program, but partner with the private sector. And then in conjunction with the micromobility options, also basically beef up safety in the neighborhood areas where these services are provided. So provide a traffic calming program where there's an increase in traffic, and also micromobility and bicycle and pedestrian traffic. And then from there, we worked towards some information about how we're going to regulate the companies, and did some research related to the fees and permit structures that are used in Denver or other cities in the metro area and across the nation. And we agreed that it's a benefit to the city to collect data and report on the performance of these services when they're a third-party service. Next slide. Okay, thank you. So just to kind of provide you with some information about what this looks like in terms of 1 mile and what that radius area starts to serve. Basically, we're talking about the G-Line corridor. You can kind of see there the blue dots. Those are the station areas on the map, as well as the red circles. That's the 1 mile area, the radius around the station areas. Now, our focus is to provide this first and last mile connectivity to transit And some of this happens also in an area where we have Westminster and Adams County and Denver and Wheat Ridge and Jefferson County jurisdictions. While we're coordinating with our neighboring jurisdictions, these stations serve multiple jurisdictions, and the focus right now is just the city of Arvada portion of where we have jurisdiction along this corridor. Next slide. So as mentioned, the proposed service area represents 1 mile, and we are looking at this as a first and last mile connectivity to G-Line service as a pilot project. And the reason why we're looking at 1 mile is because essentially to walk to a G-Line station within 1 mile is about 20 minutes if you're on the edge of that 1 mile radius. And if you were to bike in that 1 mile area from the edge to the G-Line station, it's about 5 minutes. So in this particular area, we don't have buses in all portions of all these streets providing that connection to transit at these station areas. So therefore, the low frequency and the service being on the major roads has prompted the need for additional connectivity that would be competitive to driving to the station areas. So instead of driving and parking, the micromobility option is what's being discussed. Next slide. So just to provide a little brief history related to micromobility in our region here, we had basically in 2008, B-Cycle launching its service in the Denver metro area. And from there, between 2008 and 2018, e-scooters and e-bikes appeared in Denver. Denver created a program within that year. And then shortly after in 2019, the city of Aurora also worked towards rules and regulations related to micromobility and these shared services. At the same time, because these services were becoming popular, not just here in the Denver metro area, but also being discussed in other areas, the Colorado Legislature passed a bill allowing e-scooters to operate on roadways. So by default, these services are allowed to be on public streets. From there, in 2019, Lakewood set its rules and regulations related to scooters and e-bikes as well. And on our end, within the Public Works Department, we provided a presentation to City Council around the same time in 2019 and in 2020. First with the Transportation Committee and then later with staff, providing information about scooters and e-bikes and how they work and how they could potentially be managed and beneficial for our community. From there, in September 2020, we've launched a Speak Up and conducted a number of surveys, especially related to electric devices on trails. That was the focus of those discussions. We've had City Council workshops around electric devices on trails so far. And from there, we've actually started to have a discussion about personal versus private, shared micromobility devices provided by private companies. So that's where we're at today, is moving from not just the e-bike and e-scooters, but to the discussion about personal versus shared devices. Next. So tonight we're going to go over some of this information related to micromobility, and we're going to discuss what it is, why we would want it, a pilot, what does a pilot project look like, how would it, where would it operate, how would it be regulated, and what is the process and community engagement that we have associated with the launch of a pilot project. So with that, I'll turn it over to Adam to go through those details. And again, if you have any questions during this process, please use the Q&A and I'll be monitoring that section of this presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, John. So I think most of us have seen, these scooters and devices around different cities. So that is one form of micromobility. It also includes conventional bike sharing, which is more of a system with docks. So there would be specific places for bikes or scooters to start and end their trips. So not just being able to go from point A to point B, but you have to go from a specific location. There's dockless bike sharing, which you may be familiar with, the green bikes of Lime or the red bikes of Jump that are similar to the scooters. They can go whenever, wherever to start and finish a trip. These scooters and then other small personal mobility devices. So if you have your own scooter or even e-bike, that kind of all falls into micromobility in this definition. When we're talking about shared micromobility in Arvada, we're specifically talking about dockless bike sharing and e-scooters. And the reason we're not necessarily looking at a system with docks is just the financial cost and investment from the city to really purchase all that equipment and infrastructure to set it up is kind of beyond what our means are. And with the opportunity to implement a dockless system at a much lower cost, we feel like that is the best option to present to the public to get feedback on. So in terms of shared micromobility and the benefits, we kind of look at this two ways. For potential residents and visitors, the users of these devices, what would their benefits be? And the biggest one is that it's on demand 24/7. So whether you're a worker going 9-to-5 job and need to connect to the train stations, or if you're working in a service industry and you get out late at 3 or go in at 4 or 5, whether it's afternoon, morning, you always have these devices around. And while they might not be specifically where you want them, using an app or computer, you can find out where these devices are and get to that location to then take it for the rest of your trip. The other benefit, as we mentioned, of dockless versus a docked system is that you get point to point. So instead of having to maybe park 3 or 4 blocks away and then having to walk, you can really get directly to your destination. Similar to the benefit of having a personal vehicle is that you can take it from where you are and go directly to where you want to go, as long as parking is available. Additionally, some of the benefits are it's relatively low cost. There's low barriers to entry, and it's easy to use, whether you're comfortable bicycling or scooting. It's generally kind of just turn it on and go. So those are some of the user benefits. And then for the city, from our perspective, this is a transportation option that has low impact to city infrastructure. These devices weigh next to nothing, 50 pounds max, 100 pounds max, maybe. And that wear and tear on concrete asphalt is very low when compared to buses, trucks, personal vehicles. There's no cost to the city in terms of launching these systems and letting them operate. We're not paying these companies anything to come and operate. And we'll talk a little bit more about the funding and financials related to this system later on in the presentation. The city is planning to take in revenue fees, so minor revenues from permit fees, and these fees will then go directly into the program to cover related costs such as dedicated bike and scooter parking, and maybe some other options to help add bike lanes and things to make it safer for people to bike and scoot within the city. And lastly, it is a solution to this last mile transit connectivity issue that every city is trying to solve and trying to provide the most options with the largest benefit to its residents. So I want to talk a little bit about the pilot project, these rules and regulations, operations, funding, and then we'll get into some of the public input and data that we'll be collecting and sharing. So in terms of procurement and within the pilot project, we're planning to limit the number of companies that can operate to only 2. So maybe it'll only be 1, but no more than 2 companies. We have an application process that they'll have to go through. The city will review and score, and then the top vendors that meet and exceed that city criteria will be selected to operate during that pilot period. And the way this is going to work is they'll apply for a permit that's revocable. So this gives us the ability to say, you're not meeting the rules and regulations, you're not doing what you said, so we're going to revoke your permit, and then you can no longer operate within the city. So that gives us some strength to make sure that they are operating how we want, and they're following the rules and regulations that we're setting up. Each company will be allowed to deploy a maximum of 200 total devices, and a maximum of 100 bikes and 100 scooters each. So if one of those companies is only operating scooters, then they'll be limited to 100. If they have bikes and scooters, then they can offer up to 100 each for 200 total. So 400 is the max, but we may not get to that number. We may start lower, and these companies may ramp up over a few months. We'll be using technology to limit the service area to this general 1 mile radius from the transit stations to collect data along the G line. And so the companies are able to do that through a process that's known as Geolocation Services. So basically the app and the technology knows when you're in or inside or outside of the service area. If you're outside of it, you won't be able to park your device. You'll have to bring it back in. And if you go outside of the service area, the electric assist will turn off. So then you just kind of have a kick scooter that weighs a lot. So it's incentive to not take it outside of that zone. And as John mentioned, we are coordinating with our neighboring jurisdictions about how to handle this potential spillover issues. Obviously, it's happening from Denver. We've seen some devices in Arvada. Depending on the jurisdiction, they may not care. It may be so minor that it's not an issue that they say, it's okay if the scooters operate here, but then your operators, the companies have to pick them up, or maybe we'll end up with that hard boundary. But as of right now, we're setting it kind of as a hard boundary within that 1 mile radius, and then also at the city border. So this was that initial 1 mile zone that John showed. That's kind of just a straight circle, but doesn't really take into consideration existing streets, neighborhoods, how people actually operate. So you can see this red line is more or less our more detailed and defined service area zone. So in some areas, it's a little bit inside the 1 mile radius, some it's a little bit outside, but we really tried to aim it as the next collector street that was just outside of that 1 mile radius, looking at parks, schools, business centers, where people actually want to go, so that we're not kind of cutting this off and not letting people finish their trip where they would choose to end it. And so this is our proposed service area. It's roughly about 7 square miles. So it's about 4 miles from west to east and between 1.5 miles north and south. And so it's a pretty big area. Relative to some of the comments we've seen have been geared towards thinking it's maybe just a 1 mile zone around Old Town, but it really does stretch all the way from Tennyson Street to Ward Road. So a pretty decent sized service area. So as you mentioned, these devices, they'll only be allowed to park in the pilot project area within the city of Arvada. If you try and end your trip outside of it, it'll beep, it won't let you end your trip, and you'll have to bring it back within the city, pending some discussions with our jurisdictions. As I mentioned, the electric assist will also turn off outside of the pilot project area, and then it will also turn off within Old Town around the pedestrian mall area. So we'll be working to refine that if this project moves forward, about where those zones turn off, because we want to make sure that we're not causing issues beyond what people are using to use regular transportation, that we're not encouraging them to scoot through heavily pedestrian areas at high speeds. And then the hours of operations are planned to be 24/7, so you can use them whenever you need. So in terms of these devices, we've heard a lot of questions about where can we use these: sidewalks, not sidewalks, trails, etc. So in Old Town, they'll be prohibited on all sidewalks. So we'll have that kind of geo-located boundary. And then with the upcoming Ped Mall that exists, we'll probably have some further restrictions there. Bike lanes, they're encouraged. And then sidewalks and trails, if bikes are permitted, scooters are permitted. And so pretty much in Arvada, all sidewalks are open for bike riding. If you're a bicyclist on a sidewalk, you have to kind of yield to pedestrians, but you'll be allowed to use a scooter on sidewalks as well, unless explicitly prohibited. And as John mentioned and touched on, City Council, we're going through the process to have an ordinance brought in front of them for adoption that will allow electric assist bicycles and scooters on trails. And this would apply both to shared bicycles and scooters and personal bicycles and scooters. So just to touch a little bit more about our permit fee structure, So we are looking to plan for both an annual permit fee that would be upfront, that would help us to design and plan for these kind of designated parking areas, and then a potential additional fee per vehicle or per ride, with the thought that the more devices that are operating in the city, the more time and energy it's going to take from city staff, and the fees should cover those costs. So as I mentioned, those will be used to cover staff time to administer the program, provide additional needed infrastructure such as bike racks and parking areas, and potentially support other infrastructure to make streets more comfortable for riding a bicycle and a scooter and walking. So anything that we can use to kind of slow speeds in those heavily pedestrian areas. So we're very aware that parking is probably the hottest issue related to scooters. You know, they kind of people seem to park them wherever they want. They're not always set up right. They're sometimes blocking curb ramps and things like that. So within our permit structure and the rules and regulations, there are clear guidance about where you can and can't park. But some of these pictures here are the designs that other cities have done where they've been able to find street space that is then dedicated to bicycling, parking, and scooting. And this helps to kind of collect everything in those areas. So we don't think it'll solve all the issues, especially at the beginning, but we feel like having this guidance here from the get-go kind of sets the standard that we're expecting you to use these spaces when they're available. So additionally, you know, you will be allowed to park these devices on sidewalks that are wide enough where there's at least 4 feet of space that can remain. So that meets ADA requirements. And as part of ending a trip on these devices, users have to take a picture of the parked device, and that's supposed to help verify that they are following those instructions. So we'll be working with our vendors to see how strict we can make that and how enforceable we can continue to have them in case something isn't done right, how quickly they'll be able to get out there and remedy that situation. We are proposing that parking would be allowed on streets kind of in that gutter pen area. So we don't want a scooter to take up a full car parking space, but if there's low parking areas and there's space in that gutter pan that's off the sidewalk, especially in the older parts of town where we have narrower sidewalks, we want to encourage people to park there. Also allowed to park on hardscaped areas between the roadway and sidewalk, other open paved areas. So if there's kind of like a tree lawn around Old Town that is graded or brick outside of the sidewalk, yes, you can park there. If it's a tree area that has grass and natural surfaces, you're not going to be allowed to park there. And as I mentioned, we'll be looking to encourage parking at designated bike racks and parking areas. So as I mentioned, our pilot project requirements for these companies are going to be that they need to follow our rules and regulations, or their permit can be revoked and service can be suspended. And if they wanted to reactivate their service, they would need to present a plan that's going to let us feel comfortable that the issues that have been resolved. They're going to be required to have staff in Arvada that's responding both proactively to review these issues, relocate bikes and scooters both on a daily basis, but during the day as well, and respond to complaints in a timely manner. And the scooters and bikes also have local company info on the bicycles themselves and also in the app. So, you know, in the worst case scenario, if somebody finds a scooter blocking a curb ramp or something and they don't want to move it for whatever reason, they can quickly contact these companies and we'll be expecting them to respond quickly. We've also created this email address, emobility@arvada.org, that we're using both now during this kind of pre-planning process, and then if the program gets up and running during the program, where we can get issues, where people can let us know what's going on, what they're seeing, and we can monitor that. The companies will be able to monitor that, and we'll be able to respond as quick as possible. So at the end, you know, the whole point of a pilot project is to test this out, collect data and information, and see if this really is being a benefit, if it's being neutral, or if it's having a negative impact on the community. So the vendors will be required to submit reports to the city about number of trips, geodata on trip locations, length, time, and then also information about complaints, calls, safety issues, things like that. All of this information that they submit is not tied to your person individually. It's an anonymized, and then kind of distributed just like, here was a trip, this was the length of time, this is where a person went from A to B, not specifically tied to this account did these trips on these days. We're expecting the pilot project to last 6 to 9 months, depending on when we launch, with the goal to include one summer time period when usage would be high. So if we don't start until October, November, then we would want it to go all the way through next summer. If we're able to get up and running this summer, then maybe we'd count that in next spring, and that would be able to kind of cover our 6 to 9 month period where we have enough data to make a decision. And as we mentioned, the city's coordinating with our neighboring jurisdictions. So our proposed process to launch, here we are starting our first of 4 public engagement events. We've got the online survey and Speak Up Arvada page that we're seeing a lot of activity on, which is great. Once we go through, if we do move forward and go through our application process and pick our vendors, each of those companies would be required to do engagement in the community, in person, COVID obviously pending, but to get out there and really show people how these devices work, how to park them, give out helmets, things like that, and really help spread the word. We're also going through the process at the same time about updating some ordinances, finalizing our rules and regulations and permit structure and things that need to be approved by our city council. Before we start, we definitely want to implement some of these preferred parking zones. And then the anticipation would be a late summer, early fall launch of this pilot program. So just to talk a little bit about funding, we're not paying any of these companies to come and operate within the city. There's no specific cost for operating. And as we mentioned, these micromobility companies will be applying for and paying for permit fees based on their number of devices to help the city recuperate its costs for operating the program. And then that funding is going to support direct and indirect program expenses. So to talk a little bit about the future, potentially from pilot project to next steps. So, if we go through this 6 to 9 month period, we collect all our data throughout this. It's going to be kind of an ongoing thing. So we can tweak the program, change rules as we're going on. It's not going to be just a start and end. But when that time does end, we'll use that available data to make a recommendation to either open the program citywide and expand it, or end that shared micromobility program. And that's really our goal of the pilot program, is to collect enough data and be able to make a decision that this is a benefit to the city and can be expanded, or it's been negative or neutral and it's not worth it and we would end it. So we'll be collecting all that data and analyzing it, and then presenting a report and presentation to City Council that will include information about trips and usage, public feedback during the project, both complaints and support, the operator's responsibility, how well they were able to follow rules, what did work and what didn't work, and then any information about safety data, crashes, anything that's occurred during that pilot period. So for public engagement, we're kind of doing this here on the front end, and based off this initial round of public feedback, I think we'll have a decision about launching the program or not. And then if we do launch, throughout that 6 to 9 month period, we'll be collecting data again. So we've got the 4 public meetings that you can sign up for via Zoom. If you're not familiar with the Speak Up Arvada page, the link is here. This will be posted on our webpage, both on the city's webpage and Speak Up, where you can see this presentation. Comments will always be able to be emailed to our new email address for this program. And then our public comment period is open for a little bit less than a month from today's date, Sunday, May 16th. So that should give us enough time to get feedback from those who are interested in providing. So with that, I just want to say thank you for attending, and we will try and answer any Q&A questions.
Thanks, Adam. So I'll go through a couple of questions that were posted in the Q&A, and there are a couple more also coming in. So I'll go through all those. So the first question is related to the expansion of the project. So it says if the pilot is successful, would the micromobility scooters, e-bikes still be restricted to the 1 mile radius or be expanded to other areas of Arvada? Is the plan only about renting these vehicles, or does it include similar devices that are owned by residents?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if you own your own device, you can currently take it. You can pretty much use it anywhere you want. Bicycles are allowed on the road. Technically in the city, you're not allowed to use scooters on the streets yet, but we're working on updating that code change. But the plan is, in generally, you would be able to use your personal scooter or bicycle, electric or regular, wherever you want. And then the pilot project is just for those shared devices that are rentable. At that point, after the pilot project, if it is successful, the plan, at this point would be to open it up citywide. Maybe we would do a smaller expansion, but we'll have that decision and discussion down the road from here. But yeah, the plan is to open it up wider if successful.
Thank you. There were also a couple of questions related to the maximum speed, and I was able to find the information real quick online that 18 miles per hour is the maximum speed of these devices. But the question is, will the devices be programmed not to exceed a certain speed? And would you like to help with that question, Adam?
Yeah, I don't think we've finalized that question or the answer to that question. A lot of jurisdictions we've seen have capped scooter speeds at 15 miles an hour. Some other jurisdictions have said, the technical cap on them is 15, but if you're riding on a sidewalk, you should only go 6 since you can see it. So that'll be some discussions that we have as we finalize these rules. But I would say it's likely that we'll put maybe a 15 mile per hour cap, but I think it's unlikely that we would put a 6 mile per hour speed limit or something on sidewalks. We just want people to be responsible and go as fast as they're comfortable in the environment. The environment is designed for similar to if you were driving a car.
Thank you. The next question is, if the program is fully launched and there are numerous complaints of reckless users, is there potential that the program would be rescinded?
John, if you want to weigh in as well, I would say yes, that's possible. I mean, I think if this goes very south very quickly, we don't have to be tied to the full pilot period if things go bad. So that would be my response.
Yes, absolutely. You're spot on there, Adam. We would basically fold the program if it's not successful right away. Yeah, so the next question is, if this pilot project is not well received, have you thought of any other solutions to the issue?
If the issue question is first and last mile transit, I would say yes. Our transportation committee kind of went through a bigger process about a whole lot of different options, whether it was subsidized Uber and Lyft rides, kind of like a circulator around some of the areas. And so we've looked at some of those things. And if this doesn't work, we're not going to give up on first last mile connections. There are financial constraints and other issues with a lot of the other options that just don't exist with shared micromobility, which is kind of what led our transportation committee and us to go down this route. But we will always continue to look at options. And as new things develop and come out, we want to be open-minded to what the next potential solution is.
Thank you, Adam. The last question that I have here is, will the success of this project be measured by an increased ridership of the G line or an increased rental of the scooters?
I think we're going to look at everything. I think we want to look at our people connecting to RTD, to bus routes, to the G line, how many trips are being taken, how safe those trips are, how few complaints we're getting. So we're going to have a lot of variables, and I think we want to measure them not only at the end and say this was a total number, but as time goes on, that we're seeing improvements in those numbers. I think, with the G line, one of the big issues or the service level is outside of our control. So based on current service levels, we're not seeing, and COVID and work patterns, we're not seeing as heavy G line use as we used to. But we'd like to see that go up. And if we're finding out that more people are taking scooters to the G line, maybe we'll be doing in-person surveys or coordinating with RTD on some of their surveys like we've done in the past on bicycling to the station to really find out that information about how people are getting to the station and if this is having an impact.
Yeah, and I'll add to that we do monitor parking as well in the transit hub within Old Town, and work with RTD to monitor parking at their other stations that are serving Arvada residents. So part of the goal here is to analyze all the data together and see essentially how we can maximize these public investments and have the best usage. So we'll be looking at all that data. Another question that has been presented is, what's the typical rate a user pays for these devices?
I'm not sure off the top of my head, but I think it's about $2 per minute. I could be guessing, that might be wrong. So we can definitely follow up on that. I haven't personally used one lately, so not sure off the top of my head.
Yeah, I believe it's between $1 and $2, depending on which service and which vendor.
Yeah, I don't think $2 a minute sounds right. That would get pretty expensive. I think it might be like a startup fee, and then it's like 20, 30 cents per minute as you go on. That sounds more in line. So I think an average trip cost is about $3 to $5.
Thank you. Yeah. The next question is, what are the main outlets you will be receiving community input from?
Yeah, so I mean, Speak Up Arvada is our kind of go-to, and we have the page open now kind of for this pre-planning or pre-launch experience, and then we'll have kind of convert it into this is an existing program, continue to give us our feedback. We'll have a website on our just arvada.org page, and then we'll kind of continue to reach out through Nextdoor and Arvada Report and some other things to keep people abreast of data that we're collecting and then feedback that we're getting and accepting as well. So we'll try and use a variety of our sources and maybe try and direct everybody to either the e-mobility at arvada.org and to the Speak Up page. Well,
with that, I think we have answered all the questions that were posted to the Q&A. Since there are no further questions, I wanted to be sure to thank everyone that attended, and thank you, Adam, for presenting. We will continue to have this very same presentation and meeting here for the upcoming dates shown on the slide, starting with the April 29th meeting coming up here on Thursday, and then 2 more next week, I believe. If you have any questions, please visit our Speak Up page. The address is, the link is provided here, and we do have an email address as well that you can reach us at. That's e-mobility@arvada.org. Thank you very much for attending.
Thanks, everyone.